His hand closed around her throat before she could say a single word. She hadn't run. She hadn't fought. She had simply walked out of the hospital where she'd spent the last 12 hours keeping people alive. And Lieutenant Victor Hale had grabbed her like she was nothing. Her badge swung against his forearm. He saw it, he read it, and he squeezed harder. If you want to know what happened next, how this man's entire career collapsed in the hours that followed, stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story has traveled. Rachel Donovan had been an ICU nurse for 9 years, and she'd learned early that the worst moments in medicine were never the ones you saw coming. It was always the quiet ones, the patient who looked stable at 9 and was coding by 10. The family that seemed calm right up until the moment they weren't. She trained herself to read a room in seconds, to catch the shift in a person's breathing before the monitor caught it, to stay steady when everyone else was falling apart. None of that training prepared her for Victor Hale. It was a Tuesday night in late November, and Hargrove Memorial Hospital in Clarkton, Tennessee, had been running at capacity since the afternoon. 3 vehicle accidents, a cardiac event in the parking garage, and a pediatric case that had stretched Rachel's team past every reasonable limit. By the time she clocked out at 11:45, her feet ached, her eyes burned, and all she wanted was her car, the heat turned all the way up, and the 20-minute drive home to Marcus. She pushed through the side exit, the one the night shift used to avoid the media van that sometimes parked near the main entrance, and she exhaled. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and clean, and for exactly 3 seconds, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to release. Then she heard the boots, heavy, deliberate, coming fast from her left. Rachel turned. The man was in a Clarkton Police Department uniform, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of certainty that belonged to someone who'd never once been told no. She didn't recognize him immediately. She would learn his name later. Lieutenant Victor Hale, 12-year veteran, current deputy commander of the department's patrol division, a man whose name appeared on the plaques in the precinct lobby and nowhere else that mattered. What she registered in that first second was his face, the expression on it, not confusion, not caution, not the look of someone responding to a situation they were still reading. It was something colder than that, something decided. He grabbed her arm before she could speak. Rachel's back hit the concrete wall of the hospital's side entrance, and the impact knocked the breath from her chest. Her badge, her Hargrove Memorial ID, with her name and her title and her department printed in black letters, swung on its lanyard and struck Hale's wrist. He looked at it. She watched his eyes move across it. She watched him read it, and she watched him decide it didn't matter. "Don't move," he said. His voice was flat, the way voices got when they'd been used to giving orders for so long, they'd forgotten orders were supposed to have reasons attached. "I work here," Rachel said. She kept her voice level. She'd used that voice on combative patients, on grieving families, on doctors who'd gotten too loud in the trauma bay. The voice that said, "I am not going to escalate this, but I am also not going to disappear. I'm a nurse. My badge is right there, you can see it." Hale's hand moved from her arm to her shoulder, turning her, pushing her harder against the wall. "I said don't move." Rachel's pulse spiked. "I'm not moving," she said. "I'm talking. There's a difference." "What is this about?" Hale didn't answer. His radio crackled. He turned the volume down with his free hand, and the gesture sent a cold thread of clarity through Rachel's chest, because it meant he wasn't responding to a call. He wasn't explaining himself to dispatch. Whatever this was, he was doing it alone. "There was a report," he said finally, "suspicious activity near the side entrance." "I just walked out of my shift," Rachel said. "I've been inside for 12 hours. You can check the log. You can call the charge nurse. You can look at the security footage right now if you want." She heard the edge creeping into her voice and pushed it back down. "I am not suspicious. I work here." Hale's jaw tightened. The hand on her shoulder moved to her upper arm. He turned her again, this time toward the wall, and when she instinctively braced, he pressed his forearm across her upper back. Rachel's breath went shallow. This was no longer a conversation. This was something else, and every nerve in her body was telling her to be very, very careful. Then the voices started. A woman somewhere to her right, a man behind her. "Hey, what's going on?" And another, louder, "That's a nurse, I've seen her in there." Hale's grip didn't loosen. He turned slightly, addressed the voices without looking at them. "Police business, step back." But they didn't step back. Rachel heard footsteps, plural, getting closer. She heard a phone camera start recording, that little click and the faint sound of the screen lighting up. And she thought, good, whatever this is, there's going to be a record of it. "Sir," a man's voice said, very close now. "Sir, she works here. You can see her badge. You need to let her go." Hale's arms shifted upward. Rachel felt pressure against her throat. Not full choking, not yet, but enough that her next breath came out ragged and wrong. Enough that the crowd registered it, and the murmur turned into something sharper. "Let her go," someone said. Someone else. "She's a nurse." Hale's voice cut through all of it. "Back up, all of you, now." No one moved, and then Rachel heard the doors. Not the side exit she'd come out of, but the emergency access door 20 feet to her left. The one that required a badge and a code. The one that only hospital staff could open from the outside. It burst open with a sound like a gunshot, and Marcus Donovan came through it at a speed Rachel had never seen from him before. Not in 9 years, not once. He was still in his surgical cap. He hadn't stopped to take it off. "Get your hands off my wife." The words didn't come out as a shout. They came out as something worse than a shout. They came out as a statement, the way a doctor announced a diagnosis. Factual and final, and not open for discussion. Hale's grip loosened. Just slightly, but enough. Rachel pulled in a breath, her first real one in over a minute, and the crowd responded to the sound of it with a collective intake of their own, as if they'd all been holding theirs along with her. Marcus covered the distance between them in 4 strides. He stopped 2 feet from Hale and looked at him the way Marcus looked at everything that required his full attention, with a precision that made people feel assessed down to their smallest component. "She is a nurse," Marcus said. His voice was exactly controlled, which in Rachel's experience was more dangerous than losing control entirely. "She has worked in this hospital for 9 years. She is leaving her shift, and you are going to take your arm off her throat right now." Hale stared at him. "This is a police matter," Hale said. "This is a medical facility," Marcus said, "and I am its medical director. And if you do not step back in the next 5 seconds, every person standing here with a camera is going to make sure the entire country sees exactly what you are doing." The crowd was larger than Rachel had realized. She counted phones by the light of their screens. 8, 10, 12. The footage was already running, had been running long enough to capture everything. The grab, the wall, the forearm, all of it. Hale looked at the phones. Something moved behind his eyes. Not regret, not remorse, something more like calculation. He stepped back. Rachel's knees buckled. Marcus caught her before she reached the ground, both arms, firm and sure, and he lowered her slowly until she was sitting on the cold pavement, and then he crouched in front of her with his hands on her face and his eyes searching hers. "Look at me," he said quietly now, just for her. "Just breathe." Rachel breathed. Behind her, she could hear Hale's voice, raised slightly, addressing the crowd. "I received a call about suspicious activity. I was doing my job. I don't answer to any of you. You'll answer to someone," a woman in the crowd said, and several people agreed. And then someone else said the footage is already uploading. And that was when Rachel saw the shift in Hale's posture. The moment the calculation behind his eyes turned into something closer to unease. He walked to his patrol car without another word. He didn't run. Victor Hale was the kind of man who never ran. But his stride was quick, and his shoulders were high, and he pulled out of the parking area without his lights on, which meant he didn't want to be seen, which meant some part of him already understood that he had made a catastrophic mistake. The crowd stayed. Someone knelt beside Rachel. Someone else offered water. A man in a delivery uniform said he'd gotten the whole thing on video and asked if she wanted his contact information. Rachel nodded because she couldn't fully speak yet. Marcus helped her inside. Gloria Tran, the night shift supervisor, was already in the corridor when they came through the door, her face set in the expression Rachel recognized as the one that meant something had already been set in motion. "I need 2 incident report forms," Gloria said to the nearest person, "and get me security on the radio right now." Marcus guided Rachel to the staff break room, sat her down, and handed her a bottle of water with the cap already off. He crouched in front of her again, still in his surgical cap, and looked at her with the kind of focus that had nothing to do with his medical training and everything to do with the fact that he loved her more than he was equipped to say out loud. "Tell me where it hurts," he said. Rachel touched her throat, then her right shoulder. Then she put her hand flat on the table and looked at it to see if it was shaking. It was. "We're going to document everything," Marcus said. "Photos, medical examination, full report." "I know," Rachel said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. She heard herself and cleared her throat and tried again. "I've walked patients through this 100 times. Marcus's jaw tightened at that. She could see it, the effort it took him not to say what he was thinking, which was that none of those patients should have been in this position either, and neither should she. "Why did he do that?" Rachel asked. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He stood, put his hands in his pockets, and looked at the wall for a moment before looking back at her. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." Gloria appeared in the doorway with a clipboard and a camera. "A county deputy was already on his way," she said. "Not from the Clarkton department. County." Marcus had insisted on that before they'd even come inside, had made the call while walking Rachel through the door, had said the words independent jurisdiction clearly enough that Gloria had written them down. Rachel gave her statement to the deputy an hour later, a man named Garrett who wrote in careful block letters and asked his questions without editorial, without skepticism, without any of the small dismissals she'd braced for. He closed his notebook, looked at her directly, and said, "We'll request Hale's report and match it against the footage and witness accounts." "What happens if they don't match?" Rachel asked. "Then we have a problem," he said. After he left, Marcus pulled a chair up next to hers and sat close enough that their shoulders touched. "You should go home," he said. "I don't know if I can drive. I'll take you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago, at the gray creeping into his dark hair, at the way he was watching her with a particular quality of attention that meant he was afraid, but refusing to show it because he thought she needed him to be steady. "I'm okay," she said. They both knew it wasn't true. He took her hand anyway. They sat like that while the hospital moved around them, monitors beeping somewhere down the corridor, a gurney rolling past, voices low and urgent in the distance. Neither of them knew yet that the footage was already spreading. A bystander had posted the first clip before Hale's patrol car had left the parking area. 38 seconds of footage. Shaky, authentic, damning. It showed everything. Rachel's badge catching the light, Hale reading it, Hale's arm at her throat, and then Marcus coming through the door. By the time they walked out of the hospital together just after 1 in the morning, the clip had been shared 400 times. By the time Rachel fell into a restless sleep with an ice pack on her shoulder and Marcus's hand on her back, it had been shared 11,000 times. By the time she woke up to her phone ringing and the winter light cutting through the curtains, the number was past 60,000 and climbing. She didn't answer the first call. Unknown number. She put the phone down. It rang again immediately. Then again. Marcus came in from the kitchen with coffee, his own phone already to his ear, and he held up a hand and mouthed the words, "Wait a minute." He ended his call and looked at her. The video is everywhere. How everywhere? He told her. Rachel put down the coffee cup, stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the street, which looked exactly the same as it always did, except that it didn't feel the same at all. I want to press charges, she said. Marcus didn't hesitate. Okay. She turned around. She needed to see his face when she said the next part. I mean formal criminal charges. I mean, I want it on record. I want witnesses. I want the footage preserved. I want his history pulled. I don't want a quiet settlement. I don't want an internal review that disappears into a filing cabinet. I want him to answer for what he did. Marcus crossed the room and took both of her hands in his. Then that's exactly what we're going to do. She believed him. She believed him because Marcus Donovan had never, in 9 years, told her something he didn't mean. But she also knew that believing him and surviving what came next were two entirely different things. And as her phone rang again and again on the kitchen table, as the notifications stacked up on her screen like a tide coming in, Rachel felt the first cold certainty settle into her chest. This had already become much larger than a parking lot, much larger than Victor Hale. And whatever came next, she was going to need every bit of strength she had left. She picked up the phone. It was a number she recognized this time. Helen Park, the hospital's chief administrator. Rachel, Helen said, and something in her voice made Rachel's stomach drop. There's something you need to know. The media has the story. All of it. Not just last night. They found your military records. Rachel went very still. Helen's voice was careful. They know your Army Reserve. They know your service history. It's already in the articles. Rachel didn't speak for a moment. She looked at Marcus, who was watching her face and already knew from her expression that something had shifted. She hadn't told anyone. She never talked about it. The deployments, the field hospital, the things she'd seen and done and carried back with her, like weight distributed so precisely across her body that she'd learned to walk normally under it. The Army was a different life, another version of herself that she'd folded neatly and set aside when she came home. Someone had unfolded it for her, and now the whole country was looking at it. How did they get it? Rachel asked. We don't know yet, Helen said. Rachel closed her eyes. She stood in the quiet kitchen of her own house, with her husband's hand on her arm, and the ice pack still cold on her shoulder. And she understood that whatever she'd thought this was last night, whatever contained, manageable version of injustice she'd imagined she was dealing with, she'd been wrong. Victor Hale had grabbed her in a parking lot because he thought she was no one. The world was about to find out exactly who she was, and that was only the beginning of what it was going to cost him. Rachel's phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days. She stopped counting the calls somewhere around the second morning, when the numbers she didn't recognize started coming in faster than the ones she did. Reporters mostly, a few attorneys she'd never heard of offering representation. One call from a veterans advocacy organization in Nashville that had seen the video and wanted to know if she needed help. She didn't answer most of them, but she listened to every voicemail because somewhere in the back of her mind, she understood that this flood of attention was also a clock. And when it stopped, the people who wanted this to go away quietly would start making their moves. Marcus had taken 2 days off, which he almost never did. He sat across from her at the kitchen table on the second morning, his coffee untouched, his phone face down, and looked at her with the particular combination of fury and helplessness that she recognized because she'd felt it herself 100 times sitting beside a patient she couldn't fix fast enough. The hospital's legal team called at 9, he said. Rachel wrapped both hands around her mug. What did they say? They're filing a formal incident report with the city. They want to preserve all internal security footage independently, separate from whatever Clarkton PD requests. Helen made sure of that last night. Rachel nodded slowly. Someone at that department is already working on the narrative. You know that. Marcus nodded. I know. She looked at him. They're going to say she was combative, that she resisted, that he had cause. Marcus's jaw tightened. They can say whatever they want. There are 14 separate videos from 14 different phones. 14 isn't 14 if 12 of them get suppressed or discredited before anyone sees them, Rachel said. I've seen how this works. I've seen it overseas and I've seen it here, and the playbook doesn't change just because there's a camera. It just gets more expensive. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's why we go through the county, not Clarkton. County prosecutor, independent investigation, every piece of evidence logged separately." Rachel looked out the window. The street was still quiet. Too quiet, actually, for a story that had reportedly been shared over 90,000 times overnight. She'd expected news vans. There were none. That worried her more than if there had been. Then her phone buzzed on the table. Not a call this time. A text. From a number she did recognize. Colonel Diana Ferris, Fort Knox. Sergeant Donovan. "I've seen the footage. My office, 0900 tomorrow. Bring your husband if you need to. This isn't optional." Rachel read it twice, then set the phone down carefully, the way she set down instruments in the ICU when she needed a second to think before the next move. Marcus read her face. "Ferris?" Rachel nodded. He exhaled through his nose. "Good." She wasn't sure good was the word she would have chosen. Colonel Diana Ferris had a way of occupying a room that had nothing to do with her rank and everything to do with the quality of her attention. She was 52, had been in the Army for 28 years, and looked at the world with the patient precision of someone who had learned long ago that most disasters were preventable if you caught them early enough. She was waiting for Rachel and Marcus when they arrived at Fort Knox the next morning, standing rather than sitting, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression unreadable. She waited until they were seated before she spoke. 3 formal complaints against Hale in the past 4 years, Ferris said, without preamble, without greeting, without anything that wasn't the point. She set a tablet on the table and slid it toward Rachel. "Pulled from the county database this morning by our legal liaison. None of them resulted in discipline beyond mandatory training. All 3 complainants were civilians. 2 of them minority residents. 1 of them a veteran." Rachel looked at the screen. The names meant nothing to her. The pattern meant everything. "They buried it," Rachel said. "Not buried," Ferris said. "Filed. There's a difference, and it's an important one, because filed means it exists. Filed means we can get it." She pulled the tablet back. "I've already been in contact with the county prosecutor's office. A woman named Andrea Chu. She's sharp, and she's not affiliated with Clarkton PD in any capacity. She wants to meet with you this week." Rachel looked at Marcus, then back at Ferris. "You've been moving fast." Ferris met her gaze. "You've been moving slow. You should have called me the night it happened." Rachel felt the sting of that, but didn't deflect it. "I wanted to handle it myself first." "You handled it exactly right," Ferris said, and her voice softened by a degree that, from Ferris, was the equivalent of someone else pulling her into a full embrace. "You documented everything. You went through the right channels. You preserved the evidence. Now you let the people whose job it is to use that evidence do their work. That's not weakness. That's strategy." Marcus leaned forward. "What about the military angle? The press is already running with it. Some outlets are framing her service as evidence she's dangerous, that she has combat training, and that Hale was justified in being cautious." Ferris's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. She looked at Marcus the way she might look at a problem she'd already solved. Let them run with it, because in about 48 hours, the other half of that story is going to come out, and it is going to land very differently. "What other half?" Rachel asked. Ferris stood. "You were a field medic, Sergeant. 3 deployments, a commendation for actions under fire. You have spent the better part of a decade keeping people alive under conditions that would break most people. That is not a threat profile. That is a service record. And once the public understands what you actually did in uniform, the people trying to use your background against you are going to wish they hadn't started that conversation. Rachel sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the question she'd been carrying since the parking lot. Do you think he knew? Before he grabbed me, do you think he knew who I was? Ferris didn't answer immediately. She looked at the window, then she looked back. No, I think he grabbed you because he thought you were nobody, and I think that is the most important part of this entire story. The meeting with Andrea Chu happened 2 days later in a downtown office that smelled like old coffee and case files. Chu was small, direct, and did not waste a single word. She shook Rachel's hand, sat down across from her, opened a folder and said, I've reviewed the footage, the witness statements, the medical documentation, and Hale's initial incident report. Rachel straightened. What did his report say? Chu looked at her steadily. He wrote that he responded to a call about a suspicious individual near the hospital's side entrance. He wrote that you were uncooperative when he attempted to identify you. He wrote that he used minimal force to maintain control of the situation. Rachel felt something cold move through her chest. He saw my badge. I know he did, Chu said. It's visible on camera for approximately 4 seconds before he dismisses it. She tapped the folder. His report doesn't mention the badge at all. Marcus's hand found Rachel's under the table. So he lied in his report, Rachel said. He submitted a narrative, Chu said carefully, that is directly contradicted by video evidence from 14 independent sources, medical documentation of injuries consistent with the force applied, and the testimony of 11 witnesses. She closed the folder. I'm filing charges this week. Assault and battery, unlawful detention, excessive use of force, criminal charges, not administrative. Rachel exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. I need you prepared for what comes next, Chu said, because Hale has an attorney, and that attorney is good, and the police union has already released a statement calling this a miscarriage of process. They're going to try to put you on trial instead of him. They're going to question your credibility, your history, your temperament. She met Rachel's eyes. But here's what they cannot question. She reached into the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a still from one of the videos, frozen at the moment Hale's eyes moved across Rachel's badge. The resolution was sharp enough to see his expression clearly. Not confusion, not caution, recognition, and dismissal. He looked at it and decided it didn't matter. That decision, Chu said quietly, is what we're going to make 12 people in a jury box feel in their bones. Rachel looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she said, Good. The charges were filed on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the story had cracked open in a direction Rachel hadn't anticipated. Not through the press, not through social media, but through a letter delivered to the Hargrove Memorial Administrative Office from the Clarkton Police Officers Union, addressed to the hospital's board of directors and CC'd to 4 local news outlets. Gloria brought it to Rachel personally, her face carrying the particular expression of someone delivering news they'd rather not carry. Rachel read it standing up in the break room, and when she finished, she read it again, more slowly. The letter questioned Rachel's account of events. It cited her military service as evidence of a trained physical response capability that may have contributed to the escalation. It suggested the hospital was creating a hostile environment for law enforcement by supporting a narrative it called unverified. And it ended with a formal request that Rachel be placed on administrative leave pending an independent review of the incident. Rachel set the letter on the counter. She looked at Gloria. Helen's already seen this? Gloria nodded. She read it an hour ago. The board meets this afternoon. Rachel's throat tightened, but not from fear. From something sharper and hotter than fear. They're going after my job. Gloria put her hand on Rachel's arm. Helen is not going to let that happen. Helen might not have a choice, Rachel said quietly. She did have a choice, as it turned out. Helen Park stood in front of the board that afternoon and did not hedge, did not qualify, did not use the language of institutional neutrality that Rachel had expected and braced for. She brought the video. She brought the medical documentation. She brought the security logs showing Rachel's entry and exit time. And she said, in front of every board member and the 2 attorneys the union had sent to observe, that Hargrove Memorial Hospital stood fully and without reservation behind Rachel Donovan, and that any suggestion of administrative action against her was not only unfounded, but would expose the hospital to significant legal liability of its own. The union's attorneys left without speaking. The board voted to issue a formal statement of support that evening. It went out to press before 9. Rachel read it in her kitchen with Marcus beside her and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was still locked. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. Then something made her pick up. Silence on the other end. Then breathing, slow and deliberate and close. "Who is this?" Rachel said. A voice, low and slightly distorted, said, "You made a mistake, nurse." The line went dead. She stood in the kitchen holding the phone, her heart hammering with a force she felt in her wrists, in her temples, in the base of her throat. And she told herself it was just words, just a call, just someone trying to scare her. But she knew what it was. It was an escalation. Someone had watched the union's attempt fail and decided to try something else. She told Marcus. He called Colonel Ferris. Ferris called the FBI field office in Nashville. And within 24 hours, Rachel was sitting across from Special Agent Carla Mendez, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and the economical body language of someone who moved through the world without wasting a single motion. "We've been monitoring communications within and adjacent to the Clarkton PD since the charges were filed," Mendez said. "The threatening call fits a pattern we've been tracking." She slid a document across the table without elaborating on what it contained. "Tell me about the voice. Male or female?" "Male. Possibly disguised. Did he say anything specific about what the mistake was?" "No, just that I'd made one." Mendez nodded and wrote something. Was there anything in his tone that felt personal, as opposed to general intimidation? Rachel thought about it. The way he said, "nurse," he emphasized it, like it was something small, something dismissible. Mendez looked up. "Like hail." "Like hail," Rachel agreed. The next morning, Rachel came home from a grocery run to find an envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. No stamp, no return address. She opened it carefully, already knowing. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line typed in the center. "Cops have long memories." She photographed it before she touched it, then put it in a Ziploc bag and called Mendez before she even went inside. Marcus met her at the door. He looked at her face and didn't ask. He just stepped aside and let her in, and then he locked the door behind them, and he stood in the hallway with his arms crossed and his face working through something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, and landed somewhere in the space between them where helplessness lived. "We need to talk about security," he said. "I know. I mean a real conversation, Rachel, not you telling me you're fine and that you've handled worse." She looked at him. "I'm not going to say either of those things." He uncrossed his arms. The tension in his shoulders didn't leave, but something in it changed. "Okay, then talk to me." She sat down at the kitchen table and told him everything she was actually thinking, not the version she'd been managing for his benefit, but the real version. That she was frightened, but not in a way she couldn't function through. That she was angry in a way that clarified rather than clouded. That she understood, with the particular clarity that came from having been in genuinely dangerous situations before, that whoever was doing this was trying to make her small, trying to compress her back into someone quiet and invisible and manageable, and that every time she refused to become that person, it would make them push harder. "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. Rachel folded her hands on the table. "We go forward. We don't detour. We don't slow down. We make sure every piece of evidence is locked down, every witness is supported, and we let Andrea Chu do what she was put in that office to do. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And if they escalate again?" Rachel met his eyes. "Then we make sure the people escalating have more to lose from it than we do." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't performance. It was the voice she used in the field hospital when a situation was deteriorating and the only move left was to hold the line. Marcus heard it. He nodded once. That evening, Ferris called with an update. The FBI had traced the threatening call to a prepaid burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store 40 miles outside Clarkton. No usable fingerprints, no footage of the purchase. But the cell tower data placed it within 2 miles of the Clarkton Police Department at the time of the call. "That's not coincidence," Rachel said. "No," Ferris said. "It isn't." She paused. "There's something else." The county prosecutor's office received an anonymous tip this morning claiming you have a history of filing false complaints. It's completely fabricated. Chu's team confirmed it within 2 hours. But it went to 3 news outlets before it was debunked, and 2 of them ran it anyway. Rachel absorbed that. They're trying to get ahead of the trial, plant doubt before it starts. "That's exactly what they're doing," Ferris said, "and it tells us something important." She let the pause stretch just long enough to make Rachel pay attention. "It tells us they're scared. People who are confident in their position don't fight like this. They don't need to. This kind of operation, the calls, the letter, the anonymous tips, this is what you do when the evidence is running against you and you know it." Rachel stood at the window. It was full dark outside. She could see the reflection of the kitchen in the glass, Marcus moving behind her, the warm light, the ordinary shape of their life. It felt both very close and very far away. "I hear you," Rachel said. "But scared people do desperate things, Colonel." "Yes," Ferris said quietly. "They do. And that's why we need to be ready. Because this is not over. This is, in fact, only just beginning." After the call ended, Rachel stood at the window for a long time. She thought about the voice on the phone, about the letter on her windshield, about the 14 videos and the medical documentation, and Andrea Chu's steady expression when she said, "We're filing charges this week." She thought about Victor Hale reading her badge in the parking lot and deciding it didn't matter. She thought about what it meant to decide that someone didn't matter, what kind of habit it had to be to look at another person's credentials, their identity, their proof of belonging, and choose to dismiss it without hesitation. What kind of department had to exist around you, protecting you, reinforcing you, confirming over and over again that you were right to dismiss it, before dismissing it became your reflex. And she thought about the other people who hadn't had 14 cameras, who hadn't had Marcus, who hadn't had Ferris and Chu, and a hospital administration willing to stand behind them. She thought about the names in those old complaint files, the ones who'd filed and been ignored, the ones whose stories had gone into a cabinet somewhere and stayed there. Her jaw tightened. She turned away from the window. Marcus was watching her from across the room. "Whatever he says in that courtroom," Rachel said, "we have the truth. And I'm going to make sure 12 people hear every word of it." The trial date came down on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks out, and Rachel read the notification on her phone, standing in the ICU corridor between patients, her back against the wall and her chest doing something complicated that she didn't have time to fully process. 6 weeks. She tucked the phone into her pocket and went back to work, because that was what she did. Because the patient in Bay 4 needed her more than her feelings did. And because motion was the only thing that kept the fear from pooling. But the fear was there. She'd stopped pretending otherwise. It had been 17 days since the charges were filed. 17 days of managed chaos, of depositions and documentation requests, and media cycles that turned and turned without ever quite stopping. The threatening calls had gone quiet after the FBI got involved, which should have felt like relief, and instead felt like the calm before something worse. Rachel had been in enough field situations to know that when the noise stopped, it usually meant someone was repositioning. She was right. The first sign came through Gloria, who pulled her aside before the Thursday morning shift change with the careful expression of someone carrying something heavy and trying not to show the weight. "There's a new attorney on Hale's team," Gloria said, "brought in from Nashville. His name is Douglas Farr." Rachel knew the name. Most people in Tennessee legal circles did. Douglas Farr was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had spent 4 decades making complicated men look like misunderstood servants of the public good. He had a 91% acquittal rate on cases involving law enforcement defendants. He charged accordingly. Rachel looked at Gloria. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday afternoon. It's already on the news." Rachel exhaled slowly through her nose. "That's a significant investment for a man who says he did nothing wrong." Gloria's expression said everything she wasn't going to say out loud. Rachel squeezed her arm once and went to start her shift. She called Andrea Chu on her lunch break, standing in the stairwell because it was the only place in the hospital that reliably had no foot traffic at noon. Chu picked up on the second ring. "I know about Farr," Chu said before Rachel could speak. Rachel leaned against the wall. "He's going to try to reframe everything." "He's going to try," Chu said. "That's different from succeeding." She paused. "Rachel, I need you to hear something. What Farr does is manufacture doubt. He doesn't need facts. He needs confusion. He needs the jury to feel uncertain for long enough that reasonable doubt becomes a place they can hide. Our job is to make sure there's nowhere to hide. The evidence we have does not allow for confusion. And if he goes after my service record again, then we use your service record better than he does," Chu said flatly. "You spent 3 deployments keeping soldiers alive in conditions most people will never experience. That is not a liability. That is the most compelling possible demonstration of your character and your judgment." She paused again, and when she spoke next, her voice was quieter. "You are not the problem in this story, Rachel. Don't let anyone, including Douglas Farr, make you forget that." Rachel stood in the stairwell after the call ended and pressed the back of her head against the concrete and breathed. She thought about Chu's voice, the steadiness in it, the particular kind of certainty that came not from optimism, but from preparation. It helped. It didn't fix everything, but it helped. She went back to work. The next escalation came 4 days later, and it came from a direction she hadn't guarded against. Rachel was home. It was just past 9 in the evening. Marcus was reading at the kitchen table, and her phone buzzed with a notification from a news alert she'd set up for her own name, because she'd learned early that finding out third was worse than finding out first. The headline read, "Hargrove nurse at center of Hale case has history of conflict with authority, sources say." Rachel's stomach dropped. She clicked the article. It was brief, sourced entirely to unnamed individuals described as people familiar with the situation, and it made 3 specific claims. That Rachel had filed a workplace grievance against a supervising physician 18 months ago, that the grievance had been dismissed, and that she had, according to these unnamed sources, a pattern of escalating minor disagreements into formal complaints. The workplace grievance was real. The context was not. 18 months ago, Rachel had reported a physician for ordering an incorrect medication dosage for a pediatric patient, a report she was required by law to make, a report that had been thoroughly reviewed and ultimately confirmed as appropriate. The physician had been given additional oversight. No one had called it a conflict with authority at the time. They were calling it that now. Marcus read the article over her shoulder. His voice was very quiet when he spoke. They went through hospital records. Rachel's jaw tightened. Or someone inside the hospital gave them the story. Someone who read the union letter and decided to help. Marcus straightened. "That's illegal." "Yes," Rachel said, "it is." She called Ferris. Ferris called the FBI, and by the next morning, Agent Mendez was at the hospital with a subpoena for the internal communications of every department head and administrative staff member who'd had access to Rachel's personnel file in the past 30 days. The list was 18 names long. Rachel gave her statement in Helen's office, methodically, without editorializing, laying out exactly what the grievance had been and exactly what it had resulted in. Helen sat across from her and looked increasingly pale as the picture assembled itself. "Someone in this building," Rachel said when she finished, "is working against me, and I need to know who it is before they do something that actually damages the case." Helen's voice was careful. "We don't know that it's someone inside. Who else has access to my sealed personnel records?" Helen didn't answer. Rachel looked at her directly. "I am not angry with you. I am telling you what I know. And what I know is that this information came from inside this hospital, and whoever provided it did so knowing it would be used to discredit me before a jury pool forms." She stood. "I need you to work with Agent Mendez. I need you to let her see whatever she needs to see. Because if we don't find this before trial, FAR will use it on the stand, and it will be too late." Helen nodded once, slowly, and Rachel believed her. The FBI identified the source 48 hours later. Not a physician, not administration, a billing coordinator named Terry Waits, who had worked at Hargrove for 6 years, who had a brother-in-law on the Clarkton police force, and who had photographed Rachel's personnel file on a personal cell phone and sent the relevant sections to a contact whose number traced back to a known associate of Douglas Farr's legal team. Waits was terminated and referred for criminal charges the same afternoon. The news outlet that had run the story issued a quiet correction buried on page 7 of their website. By then, the original article had been shared 22,000 times. Rachel read the correction and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who understood that corrections never traveled as far as the damage they were correcting. She didn't say that out loud. She filed it away in the part of herself that was keeping careful inventory of everything that had been taken from her and everything she intended to make matter. The week before the trial, Ferris drove down from Fort Knox and met Rachel for coffee at a place neither of them frequented, a diner off the interstate with good parking and no one who knew their names. Ferris ordered black coffee and got to the point the way Ferris always did, without approach, without cushioning. "There's something you need to know before you walk into that courtroom," Ferris said. She set her phone on the table, screen up, and slid it toward Rachel. The screen showed a document, internal, Department of Defense header. Rachel read it. Her pulse changed before she'd finished the first paragraph. The document was a summary of a request made, not by Ferris, not by the FBI, but by an independent oversight office at the Department of Defense that had been monitoring the Clarkton PD situation since the federal interest designation was triggered by Rachel's case. The request was for the complete internal affairs file on Victor Hale, including any materials that had not been produced in response to the county prosecutor's initial subpoena. The Clarkton department had produced the file that morning. Under the DOD request, they had no choice. The file contained something that had not been in the original county subpoena response. 18 months ago, a formal recommendation for Hale's termination had been submitted by his direct supervisor at the time, a lieutenant named Gordon Marsh, who had since retired. The recommendation cited a pattern of escalating behavior, poor judgment under pressure, and a documented history of using physical force in situations that did not meet the legal threshold for its use. The recommendation had been overruled by Chief Dennis Alcott, Clarkton's department head, with a single handwritten note attached. "Good officer, give him another chance." Rachel looked up from the phone. Alcott knew. Ferris's expression didn't change. Alcott knew. Marsh knew. At least 4 other supervisors whose signatures appear on Hale's evaluations over the subsequent 18 months knew, because Marsh's recommendation was referenced in each of those evaluations and dismissed each time. Rachel sat back. They didn't just protect him, they promoted him. "Lieutenant is a promoted rank," Ferris said. Yes. The silence between them had weight. Rachel felt it pressing on her sternum. She thought about the 3 complainants whose names she'd seen in the earlier files, the ones who'd filed and been ignored. She thought about the specific shape of being ignored, the way it told you that you were right about what happened, but wrong about it mattering, and how that combination could hollow a person out. "What happens to Alcott?" Rachel asked. "That depends on what the federal investigation finds," Ferris said carefully. Rachel looked at her. "There's a federal investigation." Ferris picked up her coffee. "There has been for 3 weeks. Your case opened a door, Rachel. What's behind it is larger than Hale." Rachel absorbed that. "Larger how?" Ferris set down the cup. "How many officers do you think knew about those complaints and said nothing?" Rachel didn't answer because the answer was obvious and it wasn't a number she wanted to say out loud in a diner off the interstate. That evening, she told Marcus everything. They sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the dishes still in the sink, the house quiet around them, and she laid it all out. The DOD file, Alcott's note, the federal investigation, the scope of what had been happening inside that department for years, and possibly decades. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "They've been operating this way long enough that they stopped thinking anyone would ever look." "That's exactly it," Rachel said. "They stopped thinking anyone would look. Because everyone who looked before got buried." His eyes met hers. "Not this time." "Not this time," she agreed. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Unknown number. Her stomach tightened reflexively, the way it had trained itself to tighten over the past 3 weeks, whenever an unknown number appeared. She picked it up. This time it wasn't breathing. It wasn't a distorted voice or a single threatening sentence. It was a photograph. Her house, taken from across the street. Daylight. Recent, within the past 48 hours based on the bare tree in the corner of the frame. No caption, no text. Just the image and the particular chill of knowing someone had stood on her street in the daylight and pointed a phone at her front door. She showed it to Marcus without speaking. She watched his face change. He called Mendez before she could even form the words. Mendez arrived within the hour with 2 agents and a tactical assessment team that swept the street and checked every parked vehicle within visual range. Rachel and Marcus sat in the living room and answered questions, and Rachel kept her hands flat on her knees so Marcus wouldn't see them shaking. The photograph had been taken, Mendez confirmed, from a position that would have been visible from the street. No attempt at concealment. Whoever sent it wanted Rachel to know they had been standing there. That was the message. Not the image itself, but the visibility of it. The confidence of someone who believed they could stand in front of her home in daylight and face no consequences. "This is designed to make you pull back," Mendez said. "To make you feel watched and cornered before you go into that courtroom." Rachel looked at her. "It's working." Mendez didn't offer false reassurance. "Good," she said instead, "because people who feel fear and don't let it change their behavior are harder to stop than people who don't feel it at all." She met Rachel's eyes. "We've traced the phone, another burner, but the tower data is interesting." She paused, and Rachel recognized the pause as the kind that preceded something significant. "It places the call within a quarter-mile of Hale's current residence." "Hale," Rachel said. "He's on conditional release pending trial." "He is," Mendez said, "which means if we can connect this photograph to him directly, he goes back into custody tonight." "Can you?" Mendez's expression was precise and controlled and gave nothing away. "We're working on it." After she left, Marcus went through the house and checked every lock, every window, every exterior light. Rachel sat on the couch and didn't try to stop him because she understood he needed to do something with his hands, needed the physical sensation of taking precautions, because the alternative was just sitting with the helplessness. And that was the one thing Marcus Donovan had never been equipped to do. She understood it because she felt it too. But underneath the fear, underneath the exhaustion and the anger and the relentless weight of the past 3 weeks, there was something else, something quieter and more durable. She felt it the way she felt her own heartbeat, not constantly, not loudly, but always there when she checked. It was the knowledge that every move they made against her confirmed the same thing. They were frightened. Alcott's note had tried to bury Hale. The union letter had tried to bury Rachel. The anonymous leaks, the threatening calls, the photograph of her house in daylight, all of it was the behavior of people who understood that the truth was gaining ground. You don't send photographs of someone's house to a person you're not afraid of. You don't pull every lever available to you against someone you think you've already beaten. They hadn't beaten her. They knew it. And the knowing was costing them more and more with every move they made. Marcus came back into the living room and sat beside her and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, 6 days. 6 days until trial, Rachel said. He took her hand. What do you need? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd promised herself she would stop managing her own answers. She needed the jury to be 12 people capable of looking at that video and seeing exactly what it was. She needed Andrea Chu's precision in that courtroom. She needed the DOD file admitted into evidence, and she needed Douglas Farr to try to use her service record against her, so she could answer him in a way that made the room understand what service actually meant. But right now, in this moment, sitting in her living room 6 days before the trial that was going to determine whether Victor Hale faced real consequences or walked back into a world that had always protected him, what Rachel Donovan needed was simpler than any of that. I need you to stay right here, she said. Marcus tightened his grip on her hand. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street. Both of them looked at the window. It passed without stopping. Rachel exhaled. Marcus didn't let go of her hand. And somewhere across the city, in the file that the Department of Defense had quietly extracted from the Clarkton Police Department's Internal Affairs Office, 17 names sat on 17 pages, connected by a pattern of decisions that had stretched across years and sheltered a man who had stood in a hospital parking lot, read a nurse's badge, and decided she didn't matter. Those 17 names didn't know yet what Rachel knew. They didn't know that the door had already opened, that the federal investigation already had their files, that the photograph sent to Rachel's phone had been logged as evidence, that the tower data had already been requested, that every move made against her in the past 3 weeks had not frightened her into silence, but had instead built, piece by piece, the most comprehensive case for systemic accountability that Clarkton County had ever seen. They thought they were applying pressure. They were actually building her case. 6 days. Rachel looked at her husband, at the steadiness in his face, and thought, we are going to walk into that courtroom and we are going to tell the truth. And no photograph, and no union letter, and no Douglas Farr is going to change what 12 people see when they watch that video. She believed it, and believing it was enough to get through the night. The morning the trial began, Rachel woke at 4:45 without an alarm. She lay still for a moment, listening to Marcus breathe beside her, listening to the house settle around them, and she took inventory the way she'd learned to do in the field before any operation that mattered. What she had, what she didn't, what she could control, and what she couldn't. What she had was Andrea Chu, 14 videos, a medical report documenting injuries consistent with unlawful restraint, 11 witnesses prepared to testify, the DOD Internal Affairs file, and the truth. What she didn't have was certainty, because certainty wasn't something courtrooms gave you. What she couldn't control was Douglas Farr, the jury's composition, or the fact that somewhere outside her front door, the city of Clarkton was already dividing itself along lines that had nothing to do with what actually happened in that parking lot. She got up, made coffee, and put on her Army Reserve dress uniform for the first time in 8 months. Marcus found her in the kitchen just before 6, already fully dressed, standing with her mug and looking at nothing in particular. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "You look like someone they should be afraid of." Rachel looked down at the uniform, at the ribbons on her chest, at the rank insignia that represented years of things she'd never fully explained to anyone outside the service. "I don't want them afraid of me," she said. "I want them to understand exactly who they put their hands on." Marcus crossed the room and straightened her collar, which didn't need straightening. It was something to do with his hands. She let him do it. "Good," he said quietly. "Same thing." Colonel Ferris met them on the courthouse steps at 8:15 in her own dress uniform, which Rachel had not expected and which made something in her chest tighten in a way she couldn't immediately name. Ferris didn't explain it. She fell into step beside Rachel as if she'd always been there, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Two soldiers walking into a building together to make sure the truth got heard. Gloria was inside with a group from the hospital, 12 staff members who had taken personal time to be present. Diane was among them, sitting in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression on her face that said she dared anyone in this room to doubt Rachel Donovan. Andrea Chu was already at the prosecutor's table, her back straight, a single legal pad in front of her, reviewing notes in handwriting so small and precise it looked like code. And then Victor Hale walked in. Rachel had known she would see him. She'd prepared for it, had rehearsed in her mind how she would hold her face when their eyes met, how she would refuse to give him the satisfaction of looking away first. But preparation and reality were different rooms, and when Hale came through the side door in a dark suit with Douglas Farr at his elbow, and when his eyes found hers across the courtroom, she felt the parking lot again with physical immediacy. The wall, the weight of his arm, the specific helplessness of her lungs, trying to work around pressure they couldn't overcome. She held his gaze. She did not look away. Neither did he, and after 5 full seconds, it was Farr who put a hand on Hale's arm and redirected him toward the defense table. And Rachel filed that away because it told her something. Hale still thought he'd done nothing wrong. Douglas Farr knew better. The judge entered and the trial began. Chu's opening statement was 22 minutes long and didn't waste a single one of them. She walked the jury through the timeline with a kind of clarity that left no gaps for confusion to occupy. She showed them the still photograph from the video, the one that captured the exact moment Hale's eyes moved across Rachel's badge. She described Rachel's 9 years at Hargrove Memorial, her 3 deployments, her commendation. And she did it not to argue that Rachel was exceptional, but to establish with precision who it was that Hale had decided didn't matter. "This is not a complicated case," Chu told the jury. "A woman walked out of the hospital where she works. A man in a police uniform grabbed her, read her identification, and chose to continue. Every step after that was a choice. The video shows you every one of them." Then Douglas Farr stood. He was exactly what Rachel had expected him to be. Unhurried, confident in the way that money and time and a near-perfect career record made a man confident. He addressed the jury in the tone of a reasonable person making a reasonable point to other reasonable people. And that tone was its own kind of weapon, because it made everything that came out of his mouth feel like common sense, even when it was the opposite. "Officer Hale responded to a reported situation," Farr said. "He was doing what police officers do. He encountered a situation he had to assess quickly, under pressure, in the dark, outside a major medical facility where security incidents occur regularly." He paused. Was his assessment wrong? Perhaps, but wrong is not criminal. Cautious is not assault. And this case is about whether what happened in that parking lot meets the legal standard for a crime, not whether everyone in this room would have handled it differently. Rachel watched the jury. She watched 3 of them nod slightly. She kept her face completely still. The first witness was the delivery driver who'd been in the parking lot that night, a man named Gerald Price who'd been making a late run to the hospital's supply dock. He took the stand in his work jacket, his hands gripping the railing, and described what he saw with the blunt accuracy of someone who had no personal stake in the outcome and simply knew what he'd witnessed. "She was just standing there," Price said. She walked out the door and he came around the side of the building and grabbed her. She didn't do anything. She didn't move fast, didn't raise her voice. She just walked out of the hospital. Farr's cross-examination was precise. You were approximately 30 feet away, correct? The parking area lighting was inadequate for that distance, in your opinion? You didn't hear the initial exchange between Officer Hale and the individual, did you? Price answered each question without flinching. I didn't need to hear it, Price said. I could see it. And what I saw was a man choking a woman who was showing him her badge. Farr moved on before the jury could sit with that too long, which told Rachel it had landed. The second witness was the off-duty paramedic who'd been visiting a colleague and had captured the clearest footage. She testified about what she'd seen, and then Chu played her video for the jury, all 47 seconds of it, on a screen large enough for every person in the room to see Hale's face clearly. The courtroom went quiet in the way that rooms went quiet when something visible made argument irrelevant. When the video ended, a woman in the third row of the jury was pressing her lips together very tightly and looking at the table in front of her. Rachel noted it. The third witness was retired Lieutenant Gordon Marsh. This was the moment Farr had tried to prevent. He'd filed a motion to exclude Marsh's testimony on relevance grounds, arguing that prior departmental records fell outside the scope of the criminal charges. Chu had argued that the pattern of behavior was directly relevant to establishing intent and to rebutting any claim that Hale's actions were an isolated judgment error. The judge had agreed with Chu. Marsh was 63, had spent 20 years in the Clarkton department, and had the bearing of a man who had spent a long time deciding whether to do something and had finally decided to do it. He settled into the witness chair, looked at the jury, and answered Chu's questions with the deliberate clarity of someone who understood that this was probably the most important testimony he would ever give. I submitted a formal recommendation for Victor Hale's termination 18 months before this incident, Marsh said. The recommendation was based on a documented pattern of using physical force in situations that did not legally require it, poor judgment under pressure, and a history of dismissing the authority and credentials of civilians he interacted with. He paused. The recommendation was overruled by Chief Alcott. Chu let the silence hold for a moment. Did you continue to express concerns about Officer Hale after that recommendation was overruled? I raised it 3 more times, Marsh said. In writing, twice. Verbally in a staff review meeting. Each time I was told that Hale had completed additional training and that the matter was considered resolved. And in your professional assessment, Chu said carefully, was the matter resolved? No, Marsh said. It was buried. Farr's cross-examination of Marsh was the most aggressive Rachel had seen him since the trial began. He challenged the documentation, questioned Marsh's motivations for coming forward, implied personal friction between Marsh and Hale that Marsh categorically denied. He asked why, if Marsh's concerns were so significant, he had retired without taking them to an independent oversight body. Marsh looked at him with the patience of a man who had anticipated the question. I reported through every channel available to me within the department, he said. The channels were controlled by the same people I was reporting about. He looked at the jury rather than at Farr. That's not a failure of reporting. That's a failure of the system I was reporting to. The courtroom was very quiet. Rachel felt Marcus's hand press briefly against the back of her chair, not touching her, just there, and she steadied. Then Chu called Rachel to the stand. Rachel walked to the witness box, raised her right hand, and looked at the jury the way she'd looked at her team in the field when a situation was serious and she needed them focused. Not performing confidence, carrying it. Chu started with the night itself. Tell the jury what happened when you walked out of Hargrove Memorial at 11:45 that evening. Rachel told them. She used specific language because specific language was true, and vague language was the tool of people who needed room to maneuver, and she didn't. She described the footsteps, the grab, the wall. She described showing her badge and the moment Hale's eyes moved across it. She described his arm at her throat and the specific sensation of her lungs failing to work properly. She described the crowd and Marcus and the 14 seconds between when Hale shoved her and when Marcus caught her. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The facts were enough. "Did Officer Hale see your badge?" Chu asked. "Yes." "You're certain?" "I watched him read it." She kept her voice level. "He read my name, my title, and the hospital's name. Then he looked at me and he pressed his arm harder against my throat." The juror in the third row had stopped pressing her lips together. She was looking directly at Rachel now, her expression open and unguarded, the specific expression of someone who had just stopped needing to be convinced. Then Douglas Farr stood for cross-examination. He moved slowly, deliberately, and Rachel recognized the pacing because it was the same pacing she used when she needed a patient to trust her before she told them something they didn't want to hear. He was building rapport with the jury at her expense. She kept her hands still on the railing. "Sergeant Donovan," he said, using her rank with the particular inflection of someone who intended it as a complication rather than a courtesy. "You have extensive training in how to manage confrontational situations, correct?" "I'm a medical professional with military experience," Rachel said. "Yes. You've been in combat zones. You've dealt with individuals who were armed and dangerous." "I've treated soldiers who were injured in those circumstances," Rachel said. "I'm a medic, not infantry." "But you have basic combat training, self-defense training, situational awareness training. Every soldier does." Farr smiled slightly, as if she'd agreed to something she hadn't. "So when Officer Hale approached you in a parking lot at midnight, your training would have given you options that an ordinary civilian wouldn't have had." Rachel looked at him. "My training told me to de-escalate, to identify myself, to remain calm, to give him every possible opportunity to stop." She paused. "I did all of those things." He didn't stop. Farr changed direction. "You filed a formal grievance against a colleague 18 months ago." Chu stood. "Objection. Relevance, Your Honor." The judge looked at Farr. "Counsel?" "Goes to pattern of behavior, Your Honor. The defense argues that Miss Donovan has a history of escalating routine interactions into formal complaints." The judge considered it. "I'll allow it. Briefly." Farr turned back to Rachel. "You filed a grievance against a supervising physician." "I filed a mandatory safety report against a physician who ordered an incorrect dosage for a pediatric patient," Rachel said. "I was legally required to file it. The review confirmed the error. The report was upheld." She met his eyes. "If that's a pattern, it's a pattern of following the law." Two of the jurors were nodding. Farr moved on. The day's testimony concluded at 4:30. Rachel walked out of the witness box on steady legs and returned to her seat, and she did not look at Hale. Not because she was afraid to, but because she was done looking at him. She had said what she had to say. It was the jury's turn now. That evening, Mendez called. "We made an arrest this morning," Mendez said. "The individual who sent the photograph of your house." She paused. "It's not Hale." Rachel's pulse ticked upward. "Who?" "His son, 24 years old, lives 40 minutes outside Clarkton. He had the burner phone, the photographs, and a text thread with an individual we've been watching as part of the broader investigation." "What broader investigation?" Rachel asked, though part of her already knew. Mendez's voice was careful and precise. "The federal investigation into the Clarkton Police Department has expanded significantly in the past 2 weeks, Rachel. What started as a review of Hale's internal affairs record has become something considerably larger. I can't give you details yet, but I need you to know that the people who tried to intimidate you were not acting alone, and were not acting only on behalf of Hale." Rachel stood in the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and felt the shape of something vast and interconnected resolving slowly into focus. This wasn't about one man in a parking lot. It never had been. It was about what a department looked like when it protected the wrong people for long enough that protection became policy, became culture, became the air everyone inside it breathed without questioning. "How many people are we talking about?" Rachel asked. Mendez didn't answer directly. "We'll brief you fully after the verdict," she said. "In the meantime, Hale's son has been charged federally. He's not getting out before the trial concludes." After the call, Rachel sat at the kitchen table and told Marcus. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without filling the silence with things he didn't mean yet. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "It's bigger than Hale," he said. "It always was," Rachel said. He looked at her. "And you're still going to walk back into that courtroom tomorrow?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to walk back in until it's done. Every day until it's done." Marcus nodded slowly. He reached across the table. She took his hand. The second day of testimony opened with the medical examiner, who presented the documentation of Rachel's injuries in clinical, precise language that landed harder than emotion would have, because it had no interpretation and no angle. Bruising consistent with sustained forearm pressure to the anterior neck. Soft tissue injury to the right shoulder consistent with forcible twisting. The examiner answered Farr's questions without wavering, because the injuries were the injuries, and they did not change regardless of how many ways Farr tried to reframe the question. Then Chu called her final witness. Gordon Marsh had been the first piece of Hale's history. This was the second. The woman who took the stand was 61 years old, walked with a cane, and had filed a complaint against Hale 4 years ago after he had detained her for 11 minutes in her own driveway because she had asked him to identify himself during a routine check. She had never gotten a response to her complaint. She had kept the copy. She handed it to Chu in the courtroom as if she had been waiting 4 years for someone to accept it, which she had. "I just wanted to know his name," the woman said. "That's all I asked. And he put his hands on me in my own driveway and told me I didn't have the right to ask." The courtroom was silent. Farr did not cross-examine her. Rachel noted that too. Closing arguments came the following morning. Chu stood before the jury and said what the evidence had already said. But she said it in a sequence so clean and irrefutable that it occupied every possible space for doubt before Farr could reach them. The video, the badge, the witnesses, the medical documentation, Marsh's testimony, the pattern that stretched back years through complaint files that a department had chosen to bury rather than act on. She ended simply, "Victor Hale made a choice in that parking lot. He made it with full information and no threat in front of him. He made it because he had made it before, and because nothing in his professional environment had ever told him he couldn't. Today you tell him he was wrong." Farr's closing was polished, and Rachel would never deny that. He argued doubt, argued complexity, argued that the video showed a moment and not a decision, argued that reasonable officers made reasonable errors under pressure, and that criminalizing those errors would endanger public safety. He was good at it. He was the best at it. But he was arguing against 14 videos in the face of a man who had read a badge and decided it didn't matter. And even Douglas Farr could not fully overcome what the jury had already seen with their own eyes. The jury went to deliberate at 11:42 in the morning. Rachel and Marcus waited in a conference room down the hall with Chu and Ferris and Gloria, who had come for both days and sat in the gallery with the quiet ferocity of someone standing guard. They drank Jjigae coffee and didn't talk much, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said inside that courtroom. 2 hours and 19 minutes later, the bailiff appeared in the doorway. Rachel stood. Her legs were steady. Whatever came next, she was ready for it, had been ready for it since the morning she'd walked out of the hospital in her uniform and decided that she was not going to spend the rest of her life being the person Victor Hale had tried to make her. She walked back into the courtroom. She sat down. She looked straight ahead. The foreman stood. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." Rachel felt Marcus's hand close around hers under the table. She did not look at Hale. She looked at the foreman. On the charge of assault and battery, the foreman said, we find the defendant guilty. The room moved. Rachel held still. On the charge of unlawful detention, guilty. On the charge of excessive use of force, guilty. The sound that followed was not a single thing. It was the gallery and the press and Gloria pressing a hand over her mouth and someone in the back saying, yes, loudly enough that the judge banged his gavel. And through all of it, Rachel sat completely still with Marcus's hand in hers and watched Victor Hale's face go the color of old paper. His lawyer leaned in immediately, urgent and close. Hale didn't respond. He was looking at something that wasn't in the room. He was looking at the end of the version of the world where he was untouchable. And Rachel could see the exact moment he understood that it was gone. She had expected to feel triumph. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable. She felt the specific relief of a person who has held something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. The judge accepted the verdict, dismissed the jury with formal thanks, and adjourned the court. And as the room dissolved into noise and motion around her, Rachel sat for one more moment in the quiet center of what she had built. And she thought about every person who had filed a complaint and been ignored, every name in every file that had gone into a cabinet somewhere and never come out. This verdict was for them too. All of them. She stood, she walked out. The 2 weeks between the verdict and the sentencing hearing were the strangest of Rachel's life. Not because they were difficult, though they were. Not because the threats continued, though one final anonymous letter arrived 4 days after the verdict, left at the hospital's main reception desk, addressed to her by name, containing a single line that said, "This isn't finished." Rachel photographed it, bagged it, handed it to Agent Mendez, and went back to her shift. Not because the media pressure increased, though it did. Reporters camped outside Hargrove Memorial for 3 straight days until Helen's attorneys sent letters and the hospital's security team made clear they were unwelcome on private property. The strangeness came from something else entirely. It came from the silence inside her own chest. The particular quiet of a person who has been running at maximum capacity for so long that when the pressure finally eases, the stillness feels almost louder than the noise had. She didn't know what to do with stillness. She'd forgotten how it worked. Marcus noticed. He always noticed. He didn't push, didn't offer interpretations she hadn't asked for. He made dinner and handed her coffee with the cap already off and sat beside her on the couch in the evenings without filling the space with words. On the 4th night after the verdict, Rachel looked at him and said, "I don't know how to stop waiting for the next thing." Marcus set down his book. He looked at her with the full quality of attention that she had fallen in love with before she'd even understood she was falling. Then he said, "You don't have to stop. You just have to let yourself notice when it doesn't come." She thought about that for a long time. The next thing did come, but it wasn't what she'd been bracing for. It came in the form of a call from Agent Mendez at 8 in the morning, 9 days after the verdict. And when Rachel answered it, her stomach did the reflexive clench it had learned to do at unexpected calls. But Mendez's voice was different this time, controlled, as always, but carrying something underneath it that Rachel had never heard from her before. Satisfaction. "We executed 12 arrest warrants this morning," Mendez said. "I need you to come in." Rachel was at the FBI field office 40 minutes later, Marcus beside her, both of them still in the clothes they'd grabbed off the chair rather than out of the closet. Mendez met them at the door and led them to the same conference room where they'd first met, where Rachel had described a voice on a phone and a photograph of her house and felt like the world was contracting around her. The room felt different now. Mendez set a folder on the table and opened it, and Rachel looked at the documents inside and the shape she'd been sensing since Ferris's coffee meeting, the shape of something vast and interconnected that she'd felt assembling itself in the dark, finally became fully visible. 14 officers from the Clarkton Police Department, 2 civilian administrative staff, Chief Dennis Alcott himself, all arrested within a 4-hour window beginning at 6 that morning. Federal charges, Mendez said, civil rights violations, conspiracy to obstruct justice, evidence tampering, and in Alcott's case, federal wire fraud in connection with the misappropriation of department funds used to retain outside attorneys for officers facing misconduct complaints. Rachel stared at the page. Alcott. Mendez nodded. The note he wrote overruling Marsh's recommendation was the start. When we pulled his full communications record, we found 17 separate instances over 6 years where complaints against Hale and 3 other officers were not merely dismissed, but actively suppressed, with Alcott's direct involvement in shaping the official narrative. She paused. One of those complaints was from a veteran, filed 2 years before your incident. The complainant was told his account was inconsistent and the matter was closed. It was never reviewed. Rachel looked at Marcus. He was very still. What happened to that veteran? Rachel asked. He moved away from Clarkton 8 months after filing, Mendez said. We're trying to locate him now. She looked at Rachel directly. Your case opened a door, Rachel. What was behind it goes back further than anyone knew. Rachel sat with that. She thought about the night in the parking lot, about the specific arrogance on Hale's face when he read her badge and dismissed it. And she understood now that arrogance had been built by years of institutional confirmation. Every suppressed complaint had told Hale the same thing. You can do this. We will protect you. The rules do not apply to you the way they apply to other people. And Alcott had written that message with his own hand, 17 times over 6 years. How long until trial? Marcus asked. Federal cases move on their own schedule, Mendez said. 8 to 12 months, most likely. She looked at Rachel. You will be called as a witness. Your case is the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument about pattern and practice. Without your incident, the door stays closed. Rachel nodded. I'll be there. Mendez almost smiled. I know. The sentencing hearing for Victor Hale took place the following Thursday. Rachel and Marcus arrived early, Ferris behind them, Gloria and Diane and 7 other Hargrove staff members filling the gallery's 2nd and 3rd rows. The room was full before 9. News cameras were permitted in the hallway but not inside, a decision the judge had made specifically to prevent the proceeding from becoming performance. Hale was brought in wearing a gray suit that looked like it had been bought for the occasion. He was thinner than he'd been during the trial, and Rachel noticed it without satisfaction. She wasn't there for what he looked like. She was there for what the judge was about to say. Andrea Chu stood and addressed the court first. She laid out the case for sentencing with the same precision she'd brought to every other phase of the proceeding, but this time her voice carried something additional, a weight that came from knowing the full context, from understanding that the man in front of her was not an isolated incident, but the visible surface of something that had been running underground for years. She cited the pattern of complaints. She cited Marsh's suppressed recommendation. She cited the medical documentation and the testimony of 11 witnesses. She asked the court for a sentence that reflected not only the specific actions of the night in question, but the sustained pattern of behavior that had made those actions possible. Douglas Farr stood and made his final argument for leniency. He cited Hale's service record, his years on the force, his lack of prior criminal conviction. He was composed and thorough, and Rachel respected the professionalism without being moved by it. Because professionalism in service of the wrong argument was still the wrong argument. Then the judge spoke. He spoke for 11 minutes, and Rachel did not take her eyes off him for a single one of them. He addressed the evidence. He addressed the pattern. He addressed, specifically and directly, the suppressed complaint record and the departmental failure it represented. And he said with a clarity that left no room for interpretation that the court did not exist to validate institutional failures, but to correct them. Victor Hale, the judge said, you were given authority and the public's trust in equal measure. You used the authority as a weapon and treated the trust as irrelevant. You saw a woman's identification, you understood who she was, and you made a deliberate choice to continue. That choice is criminal. This court finds no grounds for leniency. He read the sentence: 9 years in state prison, permanent revocation of peace officer certification, 5 years of supervised probation upon release. The gallery did not erupt this time. It exhaled. It was a different sound, quieter and deeper, the sound of people who had been holding something for weeks, finally allowing themselves to release it. Rachel sat completely still. 9 years. Victor Hale would be in a cell until he was past 60, until the career he'd wielded like a weapon had been gone so long it would feel like something that happened to a different person. He would never carry a badge again. The judge had made that permanent and unambiguous. She watched Hale as the marshal moved toward him. She watched his face in the moment between hearing the sentence and accepting that it was real. Watched the calculation that had lived behind his eyes since the parking lot finally, completely stopped. What replaced it wasn't remorse. It was something simpler than that. It was the specific blankness of a man who had run out of moves. Rachel stood when the judge dismissed the court. She shook Chu's hand, and Chu held it for a moment with both of hers and said, "You did the hard part. All I did was show people what you already knew." Outside, Ferris fell into step beside her on the courthouse steps, and they walked down together into the cold morning air without speaking for a long moment. Then Ferris said, "How do you feel?" Rachel considered it. "Like it's real now." She paused. "Like I can actually believe it happened." Ferris nodded. "That takes longer than people think." She glanced at Rachel. "You're going to be asked to speak at a lot of places after this." "I know. You don't have to say yes to all of them." Rachel almost smiled. "I know that too." Ferris stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned to face her. "What you did here mattered. Not just the verdict, not just the sentencing, the federal arrests, the consent decree that's coming, the oversight structures being rebuilt from the ground up. All of it traces back to you walking out of that hospital and refusing to disappear." She met Rachel's eyes. "I want you to know that. When everything else settles, I want that to be the thing you hold on to." Rachel looked at her. She thought about the night in the parking lot, about the specific quality of helplessness that came with your lungs not working, and the certainty that no one was going to stop what was happening to you. She thought about Marcus coming through that door. She thought about 14 cameras and 11 witnesses, and Gordon Marsh, and Andrea Chu, and Mendez, and Ferris herself. All the people who had refused to let the story end where Hale had intended it to end. "I didn't do it alone," Rachel said. "No," Ferris agreed, "but you started it." 3 weeks later, Mendez called again. This time her voice carried something Rachel hadn't heard from her at all yet: urgency. "We found him," Mendez said, "the veteran who filed the complaint 2 years before your incident. His name is David Okafor. He's in Memphis. He saw the coverage after the federal arrests, and he contacted us." Rachel sat down. "Is he okay?" "He's alive," Mendez said carefully, "but he spent 2 years believing that what happened to him didn't matter enough for anyone to act on. He spent 2 years thinking the system had given its final answer." Rachel closed her eyes. "And now?" "Now he knows the answer was wrong," Mendez said, "and he knows because of you." She paused. "He asked if he could speak with you. You don't have to, but he wanted you to know that the door you opened let him back in too." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Give him my number," she said. David Okafor called that evening. He was soft-spoken and precise, and he told his story the way people told stories they've been carrying alone for too long, in the measured cadence of someone who had learned not to expect to be believed and was still deciding whether it was safe to stop protecting himself. Rachel listened without interrupting. She let him finish. And then she said, "I believe you, every word, and I'm sorry it took this long for someone to say that to you." The silence on his end lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "That's all I needed to hear." She held the phone for a while after the call ended. Marcus was watching her from the doorway. She looked at him. "There are so many others," she said. "People who filed complaints and were told they didn't matter. People who never filed because they already knew the answer." Marcus crossed the room. He sat beside her. "I know. That's what the center needs to be about," Rachel said. "Not just me, not just this case. A place where people go when the system tells them no, and they need someone to tell them that no was wrong." She looked at him. "Is that something Helen will move on?" Marcus nodded slowly. "She's already asked me twice what you want it to be. She's been waiting for you to tell her." "Then tell her I'm ready." The Rachel Donovan Center for Victim Advocacy opened 4 months later in a dedicated wing of Hargrove Memorial. Rachel attended the opening in civilian clothes, deliberately, because the center wasn't a military achievement and it wasn't a medical achievement. It was something else. It was what happened when a person refused to let injustice have the last word, and then refused to stop there, refused to take the verdict and the sentencing and the federal arrests and call it done and walk away. The center had counselors and legal advocates and medical staff trained in trauma response. It had a hotline that operated around the clock. It had private consultation rooms and support groups, and a partnership with the county prosecutor's office that Andrea Chu had personally championed. And on the wall in the main corridor, there was a single line engraved in steel: "You don't have to face it alone." Rachel stood in front of it on the opening day, her hand resting against the wall beside the letters, and Helen stood next to her with her arms crossed and her eyes bright and said, "This is going to save lives, Rachel." Rachel looked at the words. She thought about David Okafor and the 2 years he'd spent in Memphis believing no one was coming. She thought about the 3 complainants whose names she'd first read in the county database and who had come to her trial and sat in the back row and nodded at her from a distance because they hadn't known how else to say thank you. She thought about the veteran whose complaint had been buried by Alcott's signature and whose story had helped put Alcott in federal custody. "I hope so," Rachel said. "That's the whole point." 6 months after the sentencing, the Clarkton Police Department held a public ceremony at City Hall. The new chief, a woman brought in from outside the county with a mandate for reform, stood at a podium in front of a room full of community members and read a formal departmental apology. She read it without hedging, without the language of institutional self-protection, without any of the qualifications that such statements usually contained. She named what had happened. She named the culture that had allowed it. She named the people who had been harmed and not helped by the department's choices over the preceding decade. Then she called Rachel to the stage and handed her a framed document, a formal citation acknowledging Rachel's role in bringing accountability to a department that had operated without it for too long. The room applauded. Rachel stood at the podium and looked out at the faces, some familiar, most not, and she thought about what she wanted to say and discarded 3 versions before she settled on the one that was true. "I didn't do this to be recognized," she said. "I did it because I walked out of my job one night and a man in a uniform decided I didn't matter. And I knew that if I accepted that, if I let that be the end of the story, there would be more people after me who would have to accept it too." She paused. Accountability isn't a punishment, it's a requirement. It's the thing that keeps authority from becoming a license. And it only works when people refuse to be quiet about what they know. She stepped back from the podium. She did not cry. She had cried in private, in the car on the way home from depositions, and in the hospital bathroom between patients, and once very thoroughly in the kitchen while Marcus held her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. She had earned the right to cry whenever she needed to, and she had done it, and she was done. After the ceremony, Marcus drove them home through streets that had been the territory of something frightening and were now simply streets again. They passed the hospital. Rachel looked at it without flinching. They turned onto their block, and he pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, and they sat for a moment in the quiet. Then Marcus said, "I'm proud of us." Rachel looked at him. He was watching her with the expression he'd had in the parking lot that night, when he'd crouched in front of her on the cold pavement with his hands on her face and told her to breathe. Except this time there was no fear in it, only the particular quality of love that had survived everything this year had put it through and come out the other side stronger for having been tested. She reached over and took his hand. "Me too." They went inside. The house was warm. The phone did not ring with unknown numbers. No envelope waited on the windshield. No voice told her she had made a mistake. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and Marcus filling the kettle, and somewhere outside a dog barking twice and then going quiet. Rachel sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. The hands that had held patients together in field hospitals and in ICU bays. The hands that had pressed her own badge toward a man who had chosen not to see it. The hands that had signed statements and carried evidence bags and pressed flat against her knees in a courtroom while she waited for 12 people to decide whether the truth was enough. The truth had been enough. It had always been enough. The only question had ever been whether she was willing to keep saying it until the people who needed to hear it finally ran out of ways to avoid listening. She had been willing. She was still willing. And that, in the end, was the thing Victor Hale had never understood and never would. He had grabbed her in a parking lot because he thought she was someone who could be made to disappear. He had been wrong about her from the first second, and every second after that had simply been the world catching up to what she had always known about herself. Rachel Donovan did not disappear. She stood her ground, told the truth, and made sure that when the story of that night was finally finished, it ended the right way. Not with her name on a complaint form buried in a filing cabinet, but with her name on a wall where people who needed help could find it, permanent and visible, and absolutely impossible to dismiss.